I've essentially finished the information on the Russian pyramid research, which tells you a lot about what pyramids do. What we haven't discussed in any detail so far is how does this happen? How do pyramids do what they do? And so it came to me while I was meditating this morning. I knew I wanted to start something for the new year. And I'm going to start a new series, and that's going to be called The Fundamentals of Pyramid Science. So we're going to be delving into a lot of different areas to discuss this, but what it's going to require is an open mind for most of us who grew up with traditional science and haven't bothered to explore outside of what we may have learned in high school or college or even graduate school in terms of scientific theories. A lot of this is going to be new. It's going to be new in part because a lot of this information I feel has been suppressed in the United States. It certainly has not been taken up by our scientific community, and I don't think it has anything to do with the quality of the science that's been done. So one of the major resources that I'm going to be using for backup information on this series is coming from David Wilcock. David for those of you who don't know, here's his picture up now, is a prolific researcher and has done over the years enormous amounts of information on a whole assortment of topics. But one of the first areas that he delved into in great detail and continues to do so is in the area of physics, torsion fields, and the like, and pyramids. And so when I started to read his information and watch his information almost 3 years ago on Gaia TV's wisdom teachings, none of this made any sense to me. And as I've begun to build these pyramids, and certainly have done experimentation and shown you the research of others, I've grown more and more interested in being able to understand those basic concepts myself. So what I have done recently over the holidays has been to read from start to finish a group of free books that David has out on his website, divinecosmos.com, which are free to the public, and they are called the Convergence Theory. I'm showing you the copies of each of the three books as we proceed on here. The Shift of the Ages was his first book, and this was written in the early 2000s and was updated recently with a lot of new information. The second book is called The Science of Oneness and talks about a lot of fascinating topics, anomalies and so forth, free energy, magnetism, and a lot of information on sound, geometry, resonance, and platonic solids. But it all comes together in the third volume called The Divine Cosmos. But we're going to be using all three of these books as references in our study. And for those of you who are interested, I think it's well worth your time if you're really, really interested to read all three books. I started with book 3 and I have just finished books 1 and 2. And I'm going to be going back to read book 3 as well, and books 1 and 2 for a second time because there's just way too much information to grab it all. And that's why I figured it would be good to do a summary version of what I found that's relevant to pyramids in a video series. So that's what we're doing today. I'm putting up now the outline of the information that we're going to be covering in this series. We're going to start with what is the ether. A lot of you may not even be familiar with this term, the ether. It's a term that has been in science for thousands of years, but was taken out of our Western science in the last 100 to 150 years. We're going to explore why, and also talk about contemporary scientific experiments that have proved the existence of this ether. And ether is an important concept when we get into the next topic of torsion fields. Torsion fields are something that most of us, even those of us taking physics in college, were never exposed to. And it's a missing link in the unified field theory, in my view. We're going to talk about an English scientist, Maxwell, and the field equations that he had developed in the late 1900s, early 20th century, and how those equations were subsequently changed, and all of the information and equations regarding spin, which is torsion, were taken out of his equations. And that impact on Einstein's E is equal to mc squared. And then we're finally going to talk about Nassim Haramein and his colleague Elizabeth Rauscher and the work that they have done over the years to reconstruct Maxwell's equations using spin and torsion to come up with a new unified field theory. I know a lot of this sounds pretty tough, but we're going to be doing all this without equations, or if we have some, it's going to be very, very minimal. So this is designed for the social science humanities major as much as it is for the science major. Then we're going to start talking about pyramids and other objects in the world as passive torsion generators. Now that we know what torsion fields are, we're going to look at the research of a Russian scientist, Nikolai Kozyrev. We're going to look at the research of Dr. Alexander Golod, who we've studied extensively already. And we're also going to look at the research of Dr. Ibrahim Karim, who has studied pyramids and other forms and has developed a new science which he calls biogeometry. Next, we're going to talk about sacred geometry pyramids and cones and their ability to be the best passive torsion generators. Then we're going to finally get into the topic of sacred geometry. We're going to talk about phi. We're going to talk about the platonic solids, phi spirals, and something that I forgot to put on this list, but I'll be exploring it, is the importance of the sphere in the creative process. That really comes into part 6, the torus is the basis of creation. We'll talk about that process, real-world examples of the torus, the pyramid, and the torus. And then we're going to end up talking about geometry, vibration, and higher dimensions, spherical energy structures in the cosmos and their importance, and finally, ways of harnessing torsion waves in consciousness. So it's a pretty ambitious project. It's going to take some time to get through all this, but it's going to be important to get some grounding in the basics. So we're starting with the next series, mini-series of this group is going to be about ether and what it's all about, and some really neat scientific experiments that prove that the ether does exist. Today's video is called The Ether Research of John Keeley, William Reich, and Victor Schauberger. This is part of our Fundamentals of Pyramid Science series, and this is part 2 of that series. Today we're going to be discussing what the ether is, and 3 of the early pioneers in ether research. Those 3, again, are John Keeley, William Reich, and Victor Schauberger. Before we begin that research investigation, however, I wanted to go over a definition and an introduction to the concept of ether that comes from David Wilcock's Science of Oneness book, which is on his website, divinecosmos.com. To read from David's introduction on the ether, We live in a harmonic universe built upon a unified, unseen foundation of conscious, loving energy, known as zero-point energy or ether. Up until the 20th century, all Western scientific traditions proposed that such an energy force existed, going back to at least the time of the ancient Greek philosophers and most likely to a far older civilization with advanced scientific knowledge. The existence of the ether was supposedly proven to be false by the Michelson-Morley experiment at the beginning of the 20th century, and most scientists still believe that that is correct. There are a number of reasons why the M&M experiment is flawed, and for our technically inclined readers, many of the researchers that we will be mentioning as David is in his book and in this series, have detailed explanations of how that was misinterpreted. We know that an etheric science is the only remaining model of the universe that fits together with the evidence now available. Current theories working with these ether concepts all agree that our physical reality arises from this hidden energy substance which creates all that we know and see by vibrating. And thus, like fishes in the sea, the pressure of this energetic fluid constantly surrounds us, though we do not normally notice its presence. In this wealth of new data, the etheric fluid is a source of tremendous energy that is in constant vibrational motion, flowing through all objects in the universe, creating and recreating them every second, just as a candle flame is constantly absorbing new wax and oxygen and radiating new heat and light, but still continues to exist as a measurable unit. Should this ether ever stop flowing and swirling about with such an intelligent, purposeful behavior, all mass would shed heat, gradually dissolve, and return to its primordial energy state. The flame would go out. Indeed, this new physics of the 21st century tells us that the very building blocks of mass, the atoms of molecules themselves, are not particles at all. They are ultimately instead nothing more than spherical whirlpools of energy in this flowing river of ether. And the ether itself provides the most tangible scientific way to define, explain, and even engineer the mind of God. The research that we're going to be talking about today of these three giants is coming directly from a book that was written about 20 years ago by Dan Davidson. It's called Shape Power, a treatise on how form converts universal ether into electromagnetic and gravitic forces and related discoveries in gravitational physics. The first of the explorers into the ether that we want to talk about today is John Worrell Keely. Now, John Keely is not someone that I ever heard of until I got into this area, but I think he, along with the others that you're going to find a pattern in these three people. They all figured out the ether. They all figured out how to use it and harness it, and they were all either scorned or put out of business or threatened to keep their experimental knowledge out of the mainstream. So John Keely was born about in the 1800s, and to skip to the important parts of his life, in about 1866, while subjecting water to various sound vibrations, Keely had an explosion in his laboratory which wrecked his apparatus. And this event was a turning point in his scientific dabbling, and for 6 years of intense experimentation, Keely worked to duplicate the effect of converting water to energy with sound vibration. He found that under certain conditions, a frequency of 42,800 vibrations per second would convert water to pure energy. Not steam, hydrogen, or oxygen, but a much more potent, higher powered energy, which Keely came to believe was the luminiferous ether, the very energy out of which the universe was formed. And Keely's discovery of the dissociation or etherealization of water was a fantastic discovery in and of itself, but Keely was intent on discovering all the physics behind this phenomenon. During his career, Keely used the basic discovery of converting water to pure energy to build many demonstrations utilizing that force to lift huge weights, control the force of gravity by making objects lighter or heavier, propelling projectiles, and many others. The water etherealization effect was perfected by Keely to the point of being able to break down the atomic nucleus into 27 levels or gradations of finer and finer energies. This is akin to modern physics, where they have found numerous subatomic particles, which are the building blocks of the nuclear particles such as protons, electrons, and neutrons. Keely claimed that there were countless phenomena associated with each of these energy levels within the nucleus. And some of these included energies which governed how the brain and mind operated, how gravity was produced, and what the forces were that created electricity and magnetism. Now to get into some interesting commercial attempts to put this into commercialization. In 1874, a group of investors formed around Keely the Keely Motor Company with the expressed intention of exploiting this newfound etheric force by using it to power motors. The company proved to be only a burden to Keely and of no practical assistance in his research. He wasn't a businessman, and the affairs of the company did not interest him. As a result, the motor company was eventually dissolved, but not until its founders had exploited his stock for everything they could squeeze out of the company, leaving Keely holding the bag. However, I was able to find some interesting data, which is kind of beyond the scope of this discovery, but this next page here is a page from a source that I have linked down below. It's a picture of this motor, and it's a letter which in its entirety is in the link below, from the editor of something called Scientific Arena in July of 1886. And what it talks about, we'll just read this first paragraph. These experiments have continued till satisfactory all around, and until many present have been supplied with flattened bullets. The final and most important demonstration of all was given in the actual running of the Keely motor itself, of which the world has heard so much, and which consisted of a 25 horsepower rotary engine actuated alone by this so-called etheric vapor. And here we approach the description of a performance in very simple machinery for which our readers will need to summon all their resources of credulity in order not to suspect us of deliberate fabrication. But we declare in advance that we are about to state the facts of which we are as positively certain as we are that we were personally then and there present. And in the rest of that letter, they go on to talk about the fact that this engine ran on water alone. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about Keely at this point, but suffice it to say that his company was never allowed to function. The shareholders were squabbling. In my opinion, it would be interesting research for those that are interested to find out why, since this motor functioned properly, it never got to market. I think we can all kind of have some ideas as to why that might be the case. But here's a researcher who did a tremendous amount of work, did work in levitation as well, and we've never heard of his work in mainstream science. The second person we want to talk about is Wilhelm Reich. I think most of us have heard of Reich and know of his work. Wilhelm Reich was born in 1897 in Austria and got his training at the University of Vienna from 1918 to 22, where he finished a 6-year medical degree in only 4 years. His postgraduate work was in neuropsychiatry and internal medicine. He was one of Sigmund Freud's star pupils and worked as first clinical assistant for 6 years at Freud's psychoanalytic polyclinic from 24 to 30. From 30 to 33, he founded various mental hygiene centers in Austria and Germany, and he left Austria and Germany for Norway to escape persecution by the Nazis. Reich discovered orgone energy while he was searching for an energy that was part of neurotic behavior. His breakthrough research in orgone physics was started in Oslo, Norway at the Psychological Institute of Oslo University. In 1939, Reich moved his Norway laboratory to Forest Hills, New York, where he eventually acquired United States citizenship. He was an associate professor of medical psychology in New York City and at his New School for Social Research, where he lectured on his discoveries in orgone energy. In 1942, Reich set up his research facility, the Orgone Institute, in Rangeley, Maine, and he termed his new science orgonomy. The main theme of his research is that orgone energy is a condensed form of etheric energy. The orgone box, which he invented, with its layering of natural dielectric and conductive materials, collects and intensifies orgone energy so it can be utilized. And orgone energy has potential uses in the health science to bring about better, more natural, non-invasive forms of healing and therapy. We didn't go into it in any great detail, but the end of his career was one where the FDA vilified his work and ruined his career. So here's another example of a pioneer in orgone research and etheric research whose career was ruined by the powers that be. The third that we want to talk about today is Victor Schauberger. Photo here of Victor. Victor was born in Vienna, Austria, and from childhood Victor was at home in the forest, was a close observer of nature, the animals, earth, trees, and water. Water was to become his lifelong passion, and he determined at a very early age to discover the laws and secrets of water. Schauberger saw water as a living substance filled with life and life's energies. Schauberger pursued private research. His first development was a machine which would provide good drinking water that was alive with natural vital energy. This was an egg-shaped container which had a simple small impeller in the bottom of the container. The impeller would spin at a very high speed and cause the water to form into a natural vortex, i.e. a three-dimensional spiral. Victor had discovered that when water or any other fluid or gas was spun in a vortex, it would pick up an energy charge. And this prototype has been adapted, obviously, but it's now a very popular water machine. There's a number of them. The Vitalizer Plus is probably the most well-known structured water device in the world. Victor Schauberger discovered a universal energy which was the opposite from normal electricity. It existed everywhere and was the basic foundation of life and substance. Basically, Victor rediscovered the ether as diamagnetism, the same as Reich had discovered the ether as orgone energy. Diamagnetism was conducted by non-conductors, hence the reason he called it diamagnetism, after the scientific term for a non-conductor. Schauberger discovered that diamagnetism, or the ether, would follow spiral and vortical pathways, and that these types of pathways would act as connectors of diamagnetism. By forcing fluids to move in special vortex guides, he could cause the fluid to be charged with diamagnetism, which in turn would cause the atoms of the fluids to collect an electrostatic charge. Gravity was also found to be related to diamagnetism. By moving the ether in a vortical pattern, matter within the vortex would lose weight and levitate. This effect was the basis, listen to this, of his disc-flying machines. Schauberger experimented with various hydrodynamic fluids such as water, air, and sand as the basis for the material he ran through his levitation motors. Healthful, life-giving effects were also discovered to be associated with diamagnetism. Victor found that when foods and beverages were charged with diamagnetism, they improved a person's health. Now, to expand a little bit on the subject that I'm sure all of you are most interested in. By 1930, Schauberger had developed anti-gravity machines which could fly much higher and faster than any known aircraft of the day, and developed free energy devices which achieved tremendously higher output than input power. The gravity machines resemble flying saucers or UFOs, and are documented, as have been documented by thousands of observers over the years. And a couple of the pictures of Schauberger's experimental craft are shown on the next page. In 1934, Victor was, quote-unquote, requested to meet with Hitler, and Hitler offered Schauberger a job as a scientist developing aircraft based upon the anti-gravity discoveries. When Schauberger refused, Hitler put Victor's family in a prison camp, which forced Victor to work on his inventions for Hitler. He worked for the Third Reich on anti-gravity craft from 1938 until 1945. When the Allied forces took over Germany, the Army Intelligence Corps discovered Schauberger's research, including several unfinished disc craft. This brought a new peril to Schauberger in the form of vested interests who did not want free energy technology to be released for public use. And Victor Schauberger died a broken man, and about 10 years later, in I believe it was around 1958, after he apparently refused to assist American corporations who were attempting to exploit the technologies that had been taken from him at the end of World War II. So here we see three early pioneers into the science available from the ether, and we've seen three different applications of a motor that could run on water. We saw a box that could create and store etheric energy. And finally, with Victor Schauberger, we saw how water and ultimately that technology was transformed into anti-gravity machines. And all of these devices have ultimately gone out of the mainstream scientific community and have been put pretty much under wraps by government and other forces. So the ether exists, and now that we've seen what's happened in the past, in the next series we're going to go over some more contemporary research that demonstrates even further the validity of the ether and torsion fields in that ether. The title of today's video is The Ether Research of Hal Puthoff, Harold Aspin, and Bruce De Palma. In part 2 of this series, we discussed the research of John Keeley, William Reich, and Victor Schauberger, three of the real giants from the 19th and 20th centuries in ether research. John Keeley, for a brief review, had extensive workings with a water-powered engine that he had developed and tried to put into the market in the 1860s, and also did a lot of research in anti-gravity. William Reich, who's familiar to most of us, was the inventor of the Orgone generator. And finally, Victor Schauberger, an Austrian scientist, started out working with structured water, figured out ways, in fact, to spiral water to have it cut through steel, but also was forced to work for Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, developing anti-gravity machines. But today, again, we're going to be studying Harold Aspin, Hal Puthoff, and Bruce De Palma. The information that we're using today is coming from the book Divine Cosmos by David Wilcock, a free book on his website called divinecosmos.com. And again, the first scientist we're going to talk about today, there's a picture of him up now, is Hal Puthoff. Hal is a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford University, and currently is the president of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, Texas, and was also an original member of the remote viewing program of the U.S. government. But to review his experiment, again, these are David Wilcock's words. One early example of proof for the existence of the ether comes from Dr. Hal Puthoff, a respected scientist from Cambridge University. Puthoff frequently mentions experiments from the early 20th century that were designed to see if there was any energy in empty space conducted before quantum mechanics ever existed. In order to test his idea in the laboratory, it was necessary to create an area that was completely free of air, a vacuum, and lead shielded from all known electromagnetic radiation fields by using what is known as a Faraday cage. This airless vacuum space was then cooled down to absolute zero, or minus 273 degrees centigrade, the temperature where all matter should stop vibrating and thus produce no heat. These experiments proved that instead of an absence of energy in the vacuum, there was a tremendous amount of it from a completely non-electromagnetic source. Dr. Puthoff has often called this a seething cauldron of energy in very high magnitudes. Since this energy could still be found at absolute zero, this force was dubbed zero-point energy, or ZPE, whereas the Russian scientists usually called it the physical vacuum, or PV. Recently established mainstream physicists John Wheeler and Richard Feynman have calculated that the amount of zero-point energy in the space volume of a single light bulb is powerful enough to bring all of the world's oceans to the boiling point. Clearly, we are not dealing with some weak, unseen force, but rather a source of almost impossibly grand power, which could have more than enough strength to sustain the existence of all physical matter. In the new view of science that is emerging from ether theory, all four of the basic force fields, gravity, electromagnetism, weak nuclear, and strong nuclear forces, are all simply different forms of the ether. More and more, the scientific community is being forced to accept that atoms and molecules are akin to candle flames, where the energy they release, such as the heat and light of the flame, must be balanced by energy that they absorb, such as the wax of the candle and the oxygen in the air. This candle analogy is a hallmark of Dr. Puthoff's model, which he uses to explain why the hypothetical electron does not radiate away all of its energy and crash into the nucleus. This seemingly perpetual motion within the atom is simply explained away as the magic of quantum mechanics in the mainstream view. So here's some fundamental work here that has helped to bring a rebirth of interest and knowledge and understanding of the ether into mainstream science. The next scientist results that we're going to talk about is Harold Aspin. And Harold is from Cambridge University and has a website called etherscience.org, which is just a treasure trove of information on the ether. Interesting sidelight, when I was looking up Harold to find some background information on him, I found out that Wikipedia in English has absolutely no information on Harold Aspin, but if you don't mind translating from Spanish, you can find it on Wikipedia. I wonder how that happened. Anyway, the Aspin effect is described below. Another example of latent forces existing in a system is found in the Aspin effect, discovered by Dr. Harold Aspin of Cambridge University. This experiment involved a gyroscope whose central wheel was fashioned from a powerful magnet. The normal amount of energy that would be required to rotate the gyroscope to a certain maximum speed was 1,000 joules. Like a glass of water being stirred up with a spoon, the rotation of the gyroscope would cause the etheric energy inside its central wheel to begin spiraling, and thus churning movement would continue inside the object even once Dr. Aspen brought the gyroscope to a stop. Surprisingly, for up to 60 seconds after Aspen's gyroscope stopped rotating, it would take 10 times less energy to return it to the same velocity as it had attained the first time. In other words, only 100 joules rather than 1,000 joules. This is another reproducible effect that has simply been ignored by mainstream science because it, quote, violates the laws of physics. However, with Kozyrev's work as a background, and we haven't discussed Kozyrev, but we will be getting to him shortly, we can hear the chuckles of Russian scientists as they read of Dr. Aspen's troubles in getting anyone in the West to acknowledge this effect. Wonder why he's not on Wikipedia? Our third scientist is Bruce De Palma. Bruce De Palma was a graduate of both Harvard and MIT, and you can find out a lot about him, including his famous N machine, on brucedepalma.com. And just like Dr. Aspen, don't look for any information about Bruce De Palma on Wikipedia in English, but you can find it in Polish if you can translate it. De Palma's spinning ball experiment is a perfect example of harnessing torsion waves by rotation and was discovered completely independently by Dr. Bruce De Palma, frequently cited by Richard Hoagland on the Enterprise Mission website. Within a complete vacuum, De Palma took two steel balls and catapulted them into the air at equal angles with an equal amount of force. The only difference was that one ball was rotating at 27,000 times per minute and the other was not. The rotating ball traveled higher into the air and descended faster than its counterpart, which violated all known laws of physics. The only explanation for this effect is that both balls are drawing energy into themselves from an unseen source, but the rotating ball is soaking up more of this energy than its counterpart, energy that would normally exist as gravity moving down into the earth. Now that's a really tough one to get your head around, and I continue to grapple with this because I'm used to thinking, as we all are, of the center of the earth being the source of the gravitational pull, pulling objects down from the earth, not having it come from the ether above the earth and be pressing down upon us. So from that direction. So we're going to think about that, and we need to, I do, think about it long and hard to really get my arms around it. But this is a tremendously important experiment in terms of our understanding of the ether. So to summarize these three results, Hal Puthoff has shown us that there's a seething cauldron of energy in very high magnitudes that exists in the ether. And this energy can continuously power all matter, similar to the way that a candle flame is continuously powered by wax and oxygen. Harold Aspen has shown us that a gyroscope, which is rotated to a given maximum speed and brought back to rest, requires only 10% of the original energy expended to bring it back to the same maximum speed. And this proves the ether to be like a pitcher of water that once it's stirred up, it only slowly returns to rest. And finally, Dr. Bruce De Palma, steel balls catapulted into a vacuum with the same force and the same angle will rise to different heights and travel different distances depending upon the amount of rotation of the balls. The ball that is rotating is soaking up more of the energy it encounters, energy that would normally exist as gravity. So here we have three more scientists, three more very, very interesting pieces of information about the ether and the effects of spin and torsion on those fields. Today's video is entitled Nikolai Kozyrev's Research into Torsion Fields, Phi Spirals, and Time. This is part 4 of our Fundamentals of Pyramid Research series. And today we're going to be doing first a brief review of parts 1 and 3, where we discuss the existence of the ether. Then we're going to do an introduction to Dr. Kozyrev, discuss his observations of 5 spirals in nature and his theories of time and its relationship to movement. And then we're going to go through 4 experiments, classic experiments in torsion field research from Dr. Kozyrev. One that demonstrates that simple movement creates torsion waves. The second one, that weight increases and decreases can be caused by simple movement. C, that effects of density on energy absorption and release. And finally, that energy absorbed and released is done so in spurts, and in other words, that the energy absorption and release is quantized. So to begin with, let's review this research on the ether that we discussed in parts 1 through 3. In part 1, we discussed John Keely, Wilhelm Reich, and Victor Schauberger. John Keely developed a water-powered motor and explored and built anti-gravity devices in the 19th century. Wilhelm Reich built the orgone generator and also proved the value of orgone energy in health. Victor Schauberger developed vortex water machines and spiraling water machines that could actually cut through steel, and was ultimately forced to build anti-gravity machines for Hitler during the Third Reich. In part 3, we discussed Hal Puthoff, and he demonstrated that there's a seething cauldron of energy in the ether, even when the experiments were performed in a perfect vacuum inside a Faraday cage and at a temperature of absolute 0. Harold Aspin demonstrated that gyroscope experiments prove that the ether is like a pitcher of water, that once it's stirred up, it only slowly returns to rest. And finally, the research of Bruce De Palma, who showed that steel balls catapulted into a vacuum with the same force and angle rise to different heights and travel different distances depending upon their spin. The research information that we're going to use today is coming from Chapter 1 of David Wilcock's book, The Divine Cosmos, which is available as a free book on his website, divinecosmos.com. Here's a picture of Nikolai Kozyrev, probably one of the best kept secrets in the scientific world in the West in the 20th century. Before we begin his work on torsion fields, I wanted to give us a definition of torsion so that we all understand what it means. This comes from dictionary.com. Torsion is a noun which describes the action of twisting and the state of being twisted, and in mechanics, the twisting of a body by 2 equal and opposite torques, and the internal torque so produced. Nikolai Kozyrev is largely unknown in the West, as I mentioned, so I wanted to start with some biographical and research information before we begin. Kozyrev's first scientific paper was published at the age of 17, and other scientists were amazed by the depth and clarity of his logic. His main work was in astrophysics, where he studied the atmospheres of the sun and other stars, the phenomenon of solar eclipses and radiation equilibrium. By the age of 20, he had already graduated from the University of Leningrad with a degree in physics and mathematics, and by age 28, he was widely known as a distinguished astronomer who had taught at several colleges. His abundant life took a most unfortunate and difficult turn in 1936, when he was arrested under the repressive laws of Joseph Stalin, and in 1937 he began 11 years in a concentration camp. Although he did not have access to scientific equipment during his incarceration, he was given the most brutal of initiation experiences into hidden knowledge. He knew that in the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur discovered that the building block of life, known as protoplasm, is inherently not symmetrical, and the colonies of microbes grow in a spiral structure. These expanding proportions, as shown in the diagram below, also underlie the structure of plants, insects, animals, and people. And as so many inheritors of the ancient tradition of the Atlantean mysteries have written, when discussing sacred geometry such as the spiraling form known as the Fibonacci golden mean and/or phi spiral. From his observations in the prison camp, Kozyrev considered that all life forms might be drawing off of an unseen spiraling source of energy, in addition to their normal properties of gaining energy through eating, drinking, breathing, and photosynthesis. With respect to time, the spiraling energy patterns in nature unveil themselves to Dr. Kozyrev, as we mentioned, while he was in the concentration camp. His direct knowledge informed him that this spiraling energy was in fact the true nature and manifestation of time. Obviously, he felt that time as we now know it is much more than just a simple function for counting duration. Kozyrev urged those to think of a cause for time, something tangible and identifiable in the universe that we can associate with time. And after pondering this idea for a while, we see that time is ultimately nothing but a pure spiraling movement. We know that we are tracing a complex spiraling pattern through space thanks to the orbital patterns of the Earth and the solar system. And now the study of temporology, or the study of time, is under continual active investigation by Moscow State University and the Russian Humanitarian Foundation, inspired by Dr. Kozyrev's work. On their website, they state that it is our understanding the nature of time as the mechanism that brings about appearing changes and occurring newness in the world. To understand the nature of time is to point to a process, a phenomenon, a carrier in the material world whose properties could be identified and corresponded with those of time. This may seem strange at first glance, since a tree falling in the yard could be seen as a product of a strong wind, not the flow of time. However, you must then ask yourself what caused the wind to blow, and ultimately the motion of the earth is what caused it. Now we're going to move on. We're going to discuss these concepts of time in further aspects of this, or parts of this series. But now let's move on to some of the simple experiments that prove the basis of torsion waves and torsion physics. The first one, simple movement creates torsion waves. Some of Kozyrev's experiments seemed almost deceptively simple, considering the effects that he was able to achieve. For example, the simple raising and lowering of a 10-kilogram weight would exert torsional pressure on a pendulum at a distance of 2 to 3 meters away, an effect which would even travel through walls. The pendulum was shielded in glass under a vacuum, so this effect could not have been caused by the air. Moving on to the next experiment, weight increases and decreases caused by simple movement. In another experiment, Kozyrev had a typical beam balance that's used for weight measurements, where the right side had a fixed weight and the left side had a hook for suspending various objects. In this case, the objects Kozyrev hung from the left side were just simple weights, only they were attached to rubber strips that allowed them to be easily mounted onto the balance. Normally, with the weights on either side in a stable position, the beam would stay balanced at a certain weight that could be measured on the scale. Kozyrev would then stabilize the arm of the beam balance and remove the object on the left from its hook. Then he would shake the object up or down on the piece of rubber for about a minute, and that's all it took. After doing this, when he placed the object back on the balance arm with perfect stillness, he would again measure its weight, which would always be slightly higher than before. Then the scales would show the measured weight of the object gradually decreasing as it released the energy that it had taken in. So what we see here, we've seen two experiments so far. One, the simple movement of another object at a distance would cause a pendulum to begin to move inside of a vacuum. And now we see that the simple movement of an object itself is increasing the weight of that object, and that object, once it's once again stabilized, loses energy back into its environment. The third experiment had to do with what are called latent forces existing after energy stops being generated. And here the word latent often means left over, and Kozyrev observed certain effects that continued for a time after he stopped creating any torsion waves and or disturbance of the measured objects. We remember that Kozyrev demonstrated how the simple shaking of a weight on a rubber strip caused the weight to increase, and then it would slowly drop back down to its normal resting mass once it was placed back on the balance beam. The time that the objects took to return to their normal weight is how we measure the latent force that is capable of holding. Certain objects will gain and lose weight faster than others in Kozyrev's experiments. Kozyrev concluded that the rate at which an object gains or loses weight is actually based on its density or thickness and not its overall weight. He showed that the loss of weight occurs at an exponential rate, and the denser the material is, the quicker the residual forces will disappear. Here are some examples. Lead at a density of 11 will lose its latent force in 14 seconds. Aluminum at a density of 2.7 loses its latent forces in 28 seconds, and wood at a density of 0.5 loses its latent forces in 70 seconds. If this seems hard to understand, we could think of the fact that a denser, thicker sponge, such as the foam used in a mattress or a seat cushion, has much more spring to it than a lighter, thinner one, such as a tired old kitchen sponge. The more of a spring the material has, the quicker it can absorb and release energy. Kozyrev tested these effects on a number of different objects, and what he found was that the largest effects with maximum preservation times were observed on porous materials like brick or volcano tuff. So again, to summarize, what we found here is that the amount of energy that can be retained and the speed at which it's retained or absorbed is a function of the density of the material. And finally, the research of Kozyrev shows that there's a quantization of energy absorption and release. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes discussing this before we finish this section today. We discussed Kozyrev's experiments earlier, showing that when an object is disturbed in various ways, its changes in weight would slowly return to balance over time. However, there's one important factor that emerged in these experiments that does not easily fit into our convenient analogy of the sponge, and that is known as the effect of quantization. When something is quantized, that means that it does not move or count smoothly, but only in stepwise in certain specific intervals. Simply put, the weight of an object would not increase or decrease steadily in the latent force experiments, but rather in sudden bursts. This is certainly an anomalous property for matter to have, and as Kozyrev said, in the vibration experiments on a balance, the weight reduction occurs stepwise, beginning with a certain vibration power. As vibration frequency is further increased, the weight reduction at first remains the same and then again grows stepwise by the same value. So far, a realistic explanation of this effect has not been found. As a case in point, Kozyrev studied the effects of a 620-gram weight, which he was subject to vibrations measured in hertz or cycles per second. We remember that cooling an object contracts it, whereas heating an object will expand it. In order to give the experiments nice clean numbers, although he used a 620-gram weight, the results from the weight were converted to a higher and simpler value of 1 kilogram, and the numbers shown in the diagram below and in the paragraphs that follow are normalized to this 1 kilogram weight. If you look at the table before we continue, you can see, though, there was a quantization effect going on here, a step function, which we're going to discuss now. So as we can see from this chart, as the vibrations of the object rose to the threshold area of 16 to 23 hertz, the object would show a stable weight increase of 31 milligrams. At this level, Kozyrev would increase the vibrations between 16 and 23 cycles per second and detect no further weight gain. Then suddenly, as he increased the vibrations on the weight to 24 hertz, its overall weight increase would spontaneously double to 62 milligrams. As he increased the vibrations from 24 to 27 hertz, no change in weight was registered. Yet when the vibrations increased to 28 hertz, the net weight increase would again suddenly jump up by another 31 milligrams to 93 milligrams. Each time that a new threshold would be reached, the initial gain of 31 milligrams would be added to the overall amount. As Kozyrev discovered, we succeeded in obtaining 5-fold and even 10-fold effects. Let us not forget that this effect quantization occurred in almost all of Kozyrev's experiments, whether the overall weight of the object in question was either increasing or decreasing. In order for something like that to be taking place, the basic 31 milligram interval that was measured with the 1 kilogram object must be a function of its combined volume, density, weight, and shape, similar to the tone that you hear when striking a bell of a given size, shape, and density. As Kozyrev rose the frequency of vibrations in the object, new intervals of weight increase were produced, but always in units of 31 milligrams. This effect quantization is actually a very important key to understanding the multidimensional nature of matter, illustrating that atoms and molecules maintain an onion-like structure of nested spherical waves. We're going to be talking a lot more about these topics in future episodes of this series, but for now, we're going to summarize the research results that we've talked about today. Torsion means the twisting or the act of being twisted. Microorganisms grow in a spiral structure. These expanding proportions also underlie the structure of plants, animals, and people, and these growth patterns following the spiraling form known as the phi spiral. All life forms must be drawing off of an unknown spiraling source of energy. This spiraling energy is the true nature and manifestation of time. The simple raising and lowering of a 10 kilogram weight would exert torsional pressure on a pendulum shielded in a glass under a vacuum, resulting in movement of the pendulum. Shaking an object up and down on a rubber band would increase the weight of the object, and the speed at which the object would return to its normal weight was faster for denser objects than for less dense objects. Weight increase or decrease did not occur steadily, but rather in sudden bursts. This effect quantization illustrates that atoms and molecules maintain a multi-dimensional onion-like structure of nested spherical waves. This is part 5 of that series, and the title of today's video is The End of the Ether. We're going to be talking today about why the ether has actually been taken out of the mainstream science agenda over the past 100 years. Even after Einstein, who originally thought that there wasn't a need for the ether, came back and restated almost 100 years ago that there was indeed a need for the ether for all of his equations to work properly. As a way of background, I wanted to go over, because I haven't stated this before, what I feel are the 6 core elements to understanding pyramid science. And those are understanding the existence of the ether, understanding the existence of torsion waves and torsion fields, and then understanding the ability of the ether and torsion to organize and structure reality through sacred geometry. Now, we haven't talked about sacred geometry yet. We talked about the other two. And finally, we've got three other topics: the ability of objects, including pyramids, to act as passive torsion generators, the significance of phi spirals and phi scaling in the creative process, and the existence of a multi-dimensional universe. All of these are important topics. We've kind of covered the first two, at least to some degree. The existence of the ether we've talked about through the research of John Keeley, Wilhelm Reich, and Victor Schauberger. And we've also discussed torsion waves through the research of Hal Puthoff, Harold Aspin, Bruce De Palma, and Nikolai Kozyrev. I've gotten comments that there are other people that I ought to be including in this discussion as well. And I will be over time trying to include others as well, but I'm trying to keep this relatively succinct in the beginning. I think we've gotten enough proof from these other videos of the existence of these two fields, and we'll be talking about sacred geometry soon. However, with that said, one of the things that people should be asking themselves right now is, well, if the ether and torsion fields are good, solid science, how come I didn't learn about them in school? And how come this information is apparently being suppressed? Well, I wanted to go, that's the purpose of part of today's topic, and I wanted to go over that briefly with you today. This next page is coming directly from David Wilcock's Convergence series. It's online at divinecosmos.com. There is clear evidence that any scientific effort which moves towards a discovery of the importance of these geometries, and he's also talking here as well about the existence of the ether and torsion fields, this information is being actively suppressed, as those in the secret brotherhood still have a high degree of power and feel bound to ever conceal and never reveal the secrets of the order. Many of these group members have deliberately risen to power in various scientific institutions and are thus positioned to deflect certain types of research, especially those related to free energy and anti-gravity. Richard Hoagland and the Enterprise mission, working with Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden, have shown how such suppression efforts trace back to the 19th century at least. So with that in mind, I wanted to bring in a new source of information today. There's an outstanding article which I have summarized for today's video, which is coming from the Resonance Science Foundation. This is the group that Nassim Haramein, my favorite quantum physicist in the world, founded in 2004. Now, this article is not by Nassim, but it's part of his staff, a gentleman named Adam Apollo, who wrote this article, again, entitled The End of the Ether. For thousands of years, the ether, a field which connects and permeates all things, was an essential facet of both the philosophy and science of reality in cultures around the world. Also known as quintessence, the ether is the fifth element in the series of classical elements thought to make up our experience of the universe. Greek stoichon, Japanese godai, Tibetan bon, European medieval alchemy, as well as Druidry, paganism, Wicca, Native American and tribal shamanism, and many other spiritual and philosophical lineages all describe the fundamental elements to be fire, air, earth, water, and ether. Although the ether goes by as many names as there are cultures that have referenced it, the general meaning always transcends and includes the same four material elements. It is sometimes more generally translated simply as spirit when referring to an incorporated living force behind all things. In Japanese, it is considered to be the void through which all other elements come into existence. In Hinduism, it is known as Akasha, which simply means space in Sanskrit. There are also many terms for the movement of energy through the ether or the movement of ether itself. These include qi, which is a traditional Chinese and Taoist concept for the natural energy or life force of any living thing. In Hinduism, a similar idea is known as prana, which is the life force which connects all the elements of the universe. For Hawaiian and some Polynesian cultures, this field of living force is known as mana. The same concept is known as Ruah in Hebrew, as Lung in Tibetan Buddhism, and Pneuma in ancient Greece, and vital energy in Western philosophy. It's also popularized by the idea of the Force in the Star Wars series. The ether played a central role in our framework of understanding natural phenomena in the universe all the way up until the turn of the 20th century. Gravity was thought by both René Descartes and Isaac Newton to originate from the mechanics of the ether. During the time of Isaac Newton, this was a somewhat dangerous proposition, as postulation of such invisible forces working at a distance was considered to be an introduction of quote-unquote agencies into science. Yet even until the late 1800s, luminiferous ether continued to be thought of as the medium through which electromagnetic waves travel. Proponents of both the particle and wave nature of light agreed that light must travel through some sort of medium. However, while the theories of the time required the ether in order to remain consistent, many experiments done to detect this medium failed. Its properties seemed to be too dynamic and ephemeral to test, and many of its qualities had already been explained by alternative theories. Several theories were produced to reconcile the observed properties of light with the movement of other objects that must be traveling through the ether, including the Earth. These ether drag theories were developed in consideration of whether the ether was completely stationary or moved uniformly, while objects moved through it, or if the ether was partially dragged along with massive objects like the Earth. In either case, both theories assume that movement of the ether should be detectable from the Earth's surface, since the Earth both spins and moves around the Sun. Many experiments were concocted to prove or refute the existence of the ether using these simple principles. One of the experiments done by Hippolyte Fizeau in 1851 measured the speed of light in water in order to detect if a moving medium or fluid would influence the movement of light traveling through it. Although the effect was much smaller than expected, the experiment showed that a moving medium could in fact adjust the speed of light, supporting the partial ether drag theory of Augustin Jean Fresnel. Although this was disturbing to most physicists at the time, it is important to note that Einstein expressed the importance of this experiment in his work on special relativity over a half-century later. The most famous of these experiments were performed by Albert Michelson and Edward Morley, and the final test is popularly known as the Michelson-Morley experiment. They set up an extremely sensitive interferometer to measure the etheric wind, or the presumably detectable movement of the ether as it passed through a spinning Earth traveling through space. Their experiments were designed to detect a change in the speed of light as low as 0.01%, mostly by viewing subtle changes in the interference patterns of light waves being split and recombined after traveling short distances. Their results, which showed a negligible change in the light interference, regardless of the time of day or the season, suggested that the ether must be dragged nearly completely by the Earth. However, this conflicted with the commonly observed properties of stellar aberration, as an ether being dragged along by the Earth would be expected to distort our view of the stars in various ways. Stellar aberration is an astronomical phenomenon which produces an apparent motion of celestial objects due to the change of the astronomer's inertial frame of reference. This conflict and the failure of so many other experiments attempting to verify the etheric wind resulted in continued rejection of the ether among the general scientific community of the time. When Einstein published his special theory of relativity, it solved many of the remaining theoretical problems that required an ether for explanation by replacing it with a conceptual framework for space-time itself. He suggested that there was a more simple way of looking at things which did not require a luminiferous ether, an idea which appealed greatly to the anti-ether movement popular in science in the early 1900s. The failure of the Michelson-Morley experiment also helped to accelerate the widespread acceptance of Einstein's proposed constancy for the speed of light, which, of course, now we know is no longer true. Following Einstein's publishing of general relativity in 1916, his layman's book on special and general relativity explained, according to this theory, there is no such thing as a special favored coordinate system to occasion the introduction of the ether idea, and hence there can be no ether drift nor any experiment with which to demonstrate it. Thus, for a coordinate system moving with the Earth to mirror the system of Michelson and Morley is not shortened, but it is shortened for a coordinate system which is at rest relatively to the Sun. That was a mouthful. This put the final nail in the coffin of the ether for the scientific community at large. Since that time, the ether has generally been considered for all practical purposes to be non-existent. Yet shortly after this information was published, one of Einstein's mentors, Hendrik Lorentz, wrote him a letter suggesting that general relativity reintroduced the ether rather than discarding it. While reintroducing the ether would have doomed any young emerging scientist at the time, Einstein by this time had already earned his fame through special relativity and mass energy equivalence, that famous equation E is equal to mc squared. He was still cautious at first, only offering a few public responses that brought up the subject, and his apparent contradictions did not make a new ether appealing to the scientific community. Einstein eventually published a complete explanation that would reconcile his apparently contradictory perspectives on the ether, first by asserting that special relativity does not explicitly negate the existence of an ether, suggesting only that it didn't explicitly need an ether to explain the relative properties of electromagnetism and movement. He then clarified and explained the essential importance of the ether to general relativity. To deny the ether, according to Einstein, is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. For the mechanical behavior of a corporeal system hovering freely in empty space depends not only on relative positions and relative velocities, but also on its state of rotation, which physically may be taken as a characteristic not appertaining to the system in and of itself. In order to be able to look upon the rotation of the system, at least formally, as something real, Newton objectivizes space. Since he classes his absolute space together with real things, for him rotation relative to an absolute space is also something real. Newton might no less well have called his absolute space ether, which is essential. What is essential is merely that besides observable objects, another thing which is not perceptible must be looked upon as real to enable acceleration or rotation to be looked upon as something real. This description and the rest of his paper, published in 1920, suggests that Einstein saw space-time itself as the new ether. However, this perspective was never popularized, and the ether was slowly forgotten as a metaphysical artifact of a previous scientific era. But to clarify Einstein's meaning even further, he is basically suggesting that if an object rotates, there must be a source for that rotation. If the source propelling an object to spin is not the object itself, then it must be the space around the object. So we can see here that although Einstein changed his views after hearing from his mentor and reconciled the fact himself once again to the fact that the ether had to exist, mainstream science, even though these words were coming from Einstein, refused to accept the ether. Now, we all know that the ether has come back into popular science, but not under the term ether. It's been known as zero-point field or the field and a lot of other terms. But the fact remains that the concepts that constitute the ether have been proven, and although mainstream science today still refuses to use the term of the ether has been proven countless times, and also by Einstein himself, to exist. So what we've seen here is another example of mainstream science controlled in many respects, at least according to Wilcock and Tom Bearden and Richard Hoagland, by powerful sources, has continued to prohibit knowledge of the ether to exist in mainstream science. Today's video is entitled Shape Power, the Research of Dan A. Davidson. This material is coming exclusively today from his classic work in the field called Shape Power, a treatise on how form converts universal ether into electromagnetic and gravitic forces and related discoveries in gravitational physics. Here's a picture of Dan up right now on the screen. Before we begin, I wanted to give you a brief background on Dan. Mr. Davidson has been doing research in gravitational physics, free energy systems, and electronic medicine for over 35 years. He has concentrated his research efforts in understanding the nature of energy and how it relates to the forces of gravity, electricity, and magnetism. Over the years of research, he has witnessed and collected many fascinating stories of well-documented bizarre incidents that point to a new understanding of science. He believes that the scientific community is in the process of developing a new paradigm in our understanding of nature, which will radically change the physical sciences. His degrees in mathematics and electrical engineering have provided a basis to relate orthodox science concepts to advanced experimental research. Mr. Davidson is a strong advocate of experimentation and always backs up his theory with actual working experiments and publishes experimentally verified information. Dan is one of the real pioneers, at least in the West, of this concept of shape power. There are others that we're going to be talking about. Dr. Ibrahim Karim from Egypt has developed similarly his ideas in a field that he now calls biogeometry, and we'll be talking about that later. And obviously the research that we are discussing in greater detail, that of Dr. Golod in the Russian pyramid research as well. But before we begin, I wanted to go back and review our 6 core elements of pyramid science. We've discussed the existence of the ether and the existence of torsion waves in previous parts of this series. And now we're going to get into the third topic, which is the ability of objects, including pyramids, to act as passive torsion generators. The remaining 3 subjects we'll be discussing in later parts of this series. But to begin with, let's review what Dan Davidson's concept of the ether is. Fundamental to understanding shape power is how the luminiferous ether interacts with matter. The basic premise is that all matter is simply a special case of the all-pervading universal energy filling all space, namely the ether. Over the years, the existence and understanding of ether has evolved as the basis for gravity and free energy effects at a micro and macro level. Laboratory experiments have shown that superluminal energy and information transfer have been effectively accomplished via etheric engineering, which effectively eliminates the theory of special relativity and its assumptions of a constant speed of light. In terms of the way Dan characterizes the ether, he states that my research and discoveries have led me to characterize the most basic attenuation of ether as follows. 1, a superfluidic particulate medium which pervades all space. 2, a medium which in its various modes is the building block of the physical universe. 3, a medium which in one of its modes is responsible for all the known grosser physical forces such as magnetism, electricity, electric charge, gravity, inertia, and the strong and weak atomic forces. 4, a medium which is controllable by our mind and can be manipulated by our thoughts. And 5, a medium which can be intensified and manipulated into any force or manifestation by the use of materials, shapes, and grosser forces. And that's that part 5 that we're going to be focusing our efforts on today. As far as data is concerned, shape power is the ability of multidimensional shapes to manipulate the local space energy. And in this treaty, I shall use the term ether to denote the local space energy field which permeates all space and time. The ether is a term and a concept that's not currently accepted in academic circles because the ether was supposedly disproved back in the early part of the 20th century by the Michelson-Morley experiment. Flaws in the experiment caused new experiments to be run which indicated the existence of the ether. However, the orthodox physics community has not accepted these results. Additionally, research into the last 20 years has brought the ether back in as a new guise called zero-point energy. I prefer the term ether because it connotes a much broader concept than ZPE. We are surrounded by natural and man-made shapes. From the remarkable geometry of the atomic and subatomic realm to the symmetrical beauty of flowers and seashells to the shapes of planets and galaxies, we find a kaleidoscope of shape which defines in an infinite number of ways our miracle universe. All natural shapes are the result of natural forces at work, and as such are tuned into these natural forces because they are part of these forces. And now for a really key term, so focus closely on this next paragraph. Every shape manipulates ether in some manner. A cone is an example of an infinite-sided pyramid, and as such will do many of the same things which a simple pyramid does. The American Indian teepee is an example of a near-conic shape which has many of the same energy effects as the pyramid. In this next section, we're going to go through Dan Davidson's description of shape power of a variety of different objects, and we're going to start, as he does, with the shape power of a point. The simplest geometric shape is a simple point, but a point is a mental construct because it has no dimensions of length, width, or height. To have a useful geometric entity that we can work with, we would be talking of a single etheric particle, i.e. a vortex in ether. This is simply a vortical flow of energy into the atom. The more complex the atom, i.e. with many subatomic particles, the more complex the flows in the atom's nuclear structure. On a macro level, for a complex atom, the flow will be oriented in a generally spherical pattern. In a simple atom like hydrogen, the flow will tend to look more like the lines of force around a small bar magnet. Most materials are made of much more complex atoms than hydrogen, so we can generalize and treat ether flow around an atom as generally radial, with flow either toward or away from center of the atom. If we look at the flows closely, we would find that these flows are vortexing or spinning in and out of the nucleus, as seen in figure 1411. Moving on to the shape power of a line, the next level of geometric complexity is the line. In this instance, we have an aggregated collection of atoms to form a line, i.e. from two or more atoms strung together to form a line. First, let us consider the etheric flows around two atoms next to each other, which would be the simplest possible line. The etheric flows in between the two atoms would either connect and ether would flow from one atom to the next, or the flows would repel and the flows would squirt out perpendicular to the radial line between the two atoms. The rest of the etheric flows would form a lozenge-type radiation around the combination of the two atoms. And Dan has given us a diagram here in figure 1421 showing the etheric energy flowing around two atoms, creating a simple line. By adding more atoms to the line, we simply elongate the lozenge of the radiation around the line, and the net result is etheric flows perpendicular to the line. This is illustrated in figure 1421, and when this is extended to a longer line, it's in 1422, as shown below. So as you can see in this picture, the lines of etheric energy are flowing perpendicular to the line itself. Now we move on to the shape power of two parallel lines. A pair of lines parallel to each other is similar to the two atoms next to each other. However, in this case, etheric flows in between the two lines would either connect and ether would flow from the atoms in one line to the atoms in the next line, or the flows would repel and the flows would project out perpendicular to the plane between the two lines. The net result of this configuration is a simple plane of etheric flows around the two lines. The proximity of the lines defines the amount of interaction, and again we end up with a lozenge-type energy configuration. And now for the next section, we get into the interesting part that starts to affect our pyramid analysis. It's called shape power of multiple intersecting lines. A large number of lines intersecting at a common vertex or top point would lead to creation in the vicinity of the vertex, a magnetic field and an electrostatic field. Intersecting lines generate a flowing vortex of etheric energy. The magnetic field of a permanent magnet is also a flowing vortex of etheric energy as discussed previously. A set of intersecting rods will therefore generate a magnetic field because the etheric vortex flows at the intersection of the lines are in fact a magnetic field. This means that intersecting lines or rods should also generate magnetic fields. And now if we look at the figure up on the screen, figure 1451, this is a classic experiment that Dan Davidson had performed by his friend at the time, Joe Parr. As Dan explains in a video that I watched recently, Joe's wife, I think, was Chinese, and so they had a lot of chopsticks sitting around the house, and they had this styrofoam ball. So they were able to recreate this experiment using non-metallic instruments, a styrofoam ball and chopsticks. And this was actually the way that this field was measured, and it was done with what's called a tri-field meter, which measures electromagnetic fields. Moving on, a simple experiment was performed to test the hypothesis that intersecting rods would generate a magnetic and electrostatic field. These results are depicted in figure 1451 that we just talked about. Initial measurements were taken with a sensitive meter and a flux gate magnetometer. The experiment was a resounding success. Intersecting lines create a magnetic and electrostatic field, and this at the time was a major breakthrough discovery wherein shape power, etheric physics, predicts a previously unknown phenomenon. So now that we've seen that intersecting lines, such as at the top of a pyramid, would create this etheric field, Dan went on to look at the shape power of a triangle. A triangle is the connection of three lines at their endpoints. This takes us into three intersecting lines, and from the previous section, it's easy to deduce that there will be an ether concentration at each vertex of the triangle, and this is exactly what happens. to the polarity flow inside the triangle from the center into each vertex. The lowest level of ether concentration in the triangle is where bisectors of each vertex meet in a common point called the median point. Ether flows from this point into the 3 points of the triangle as illustrated in figure 1461. If the triangle is broken up into 3 triangles, almost all the energy is forced at the center, with a small amount at the outside vertices. If a circle surrounds the tetrahedron triangles, the energy is focused entirely in the center of the circle/triangle, so a circle overrides the effects of the intersecting lines. In a figure where there are triangles around the periphery of a circle, the entire energy of the figure is concentrated into the triangles. It is as if the triangles gather and focus the energy in the circle. The next section, we're going to look at a tetrahedron. And a tetrahedron here is essentially a 3-sided pyramid. And we're going to see some very interesting results. A tetrahedron, this is the simplest of the Platonic solids, is made up of 3 connected triangles to form a 3-dimensional figure with 4 vertices. The intersecting lines of the tetrahedron have a concentration of ether in a vortical pattern at the vertices, plus there is a large negative stress concentration of ether at the geocentric center of the tetrahedron, at about 1/3 of the height. And this is illustrated in figure 1471. The negative polarity at the center is a result of etheric stress drawing on ether from the 4 corners. So here we now have, for the first time, a 3-dimensional object, and we're seeing that in addition to the vertex points around the edges, that the primary concentration of etheric energy is located in the interior of the pyramid. One of the observations which many researchers have found is that ether prefers to move in circular arcs or spiral patterns. Dr. Wilhelm Reich found that orgone moves in spiral patterns and its constant motion is that of spirals. Victor Schauberger, in his groundbreaking research work on diamagnetic energy, also discovered that the diamagnetic energy moved in spiral and vortical patterns. If we apply this observation of ether moving naturally in spiral and vortical patterns to shape power effects, then it is reasonable to infer that the use of curved or spiral pathways to mold and guide ether will enhance the effects. And this is going to be something, this last paragraph is something we're going to be getting into more in the next couple episodes as we begin to explore the research of Russian physicist Anatoly Akimov. But to finish up the work of Dan Davidson on the energy of the spiral, one of the most common forms found in nature is the spiral, a 2-dimensional figure, and its 3-dimensional correlative, the vortex. Examples of spirals and vortexes can be found everywhere. One of the most common occurrences is found in seashells. Most shells have partial or complete spirals. Even the common fan-shaped cells are a vortex shape. The well-known chambered nautilus with its highly regular logarithmic spiral is often used to illustrate the spiral. Another well-known vortex format is found in patterns generated by trees and plants as their leaves form. The leaves usually follow a vortex pattern which is related to the Fibonacci numbers. The study of this natural phenomenon is called phyllotaxis. When a spiral is drawn starting at the center and around counterclockwise towards the outside, the local etheric energy is drawn into the center of the spiral and shot to the outside. When a spiral is drawn from the outside to the center, the energy is drawn from the outside into the tool and transformed into a rainbow of colors and energizes the locality. The energy field, as seen by clairvoyance, radiates out about 4 feet from the center of the spiral and is truly a rainbow of beautiful living colors. If spirals are connected by drawing a spiral from the outside to the center and then continuing the line from the center to the outside of another spiral and doing this for several more spirals that are connected from the center of one to the outside of the next one, then energy is intensified tremendously. It is as if each spiral gathers more energy as well as intensifying the energies from previous spirals. Testing with sensitives also verified this most fascinating effect of the spiral as a shape power figure. If a person is at all sensitive to energies, they can readily feel the increase in energy intensity. Now, this last section we're not going to spend a lot more time on right now because we've got other things that we need to talk about before we get back to this. But you're going to find, and we're going to come back to this concept, that decreasing spirals that feed energy into each other, either as circles or spheres, is going to be a basic part of the geometry of the Russian pyramids as we begin to discuss this in greater detail. And this will be coming in part 4 of the series. Once we have finished this, we're going to be talking about the unique spiral geometry of the Russian pyramids and how that specified geometry works to increase the shape power of Russian pyramids. As always, thank you for watching, and you have a great day.